A very good afternoon to everybody. I'm Shresha Deshpande, a first year undergraduate student, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome each one of y'all to today's webinar on storytelling. Now, stories hold immense power. Stories have been used by cultures to preserve and pass on values and beliefs since the dawn of human language. And we're surrounded by stories every day. However, I feel the most important element of the story is the way in which it is told. That's storytelling. So, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into this world. And today we have with us Professor Michael Burns, who will enlighten us further on the same. To give you all a little bit introduction of him, Professor Michael Burns completed his PhD in documentary film history from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom in 2008, becoming the first student in the United Kingdom to submit an audiovisual doctorate. Since then, he has completed 5 documentary films for international television, and his work has appeared in over 20 countries. In recent years, he developed a strong interest in story structure and traditions of storytelling. While living in Bombay from 2011 to 2017, Professor Burns founded and directed Tall Tales, India's longest running live non-fiction storytelling event series. He has published 2 books derived from this storytelling work. He also teaches the most popular creative writing workshop in India under the Tall Tales umbrella. In addition to his work as a writing coach for aspiring writers, both would-be novelists and non-fiction authors, he also runs international writing retreats throughout his company, the Story Retreat. Professor Burns' current research interests include the universal story structure, character design, setting architecture in writing, the art of oral narration, and comparative international storytelling traditions. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. So, is the audience today mostly people from the Flame community or outside of our community?
We have people from outside as well.
Nice. Okay, great. So welcome, no matter where you're watching from. Welcome, and I hope that something I say unsettles you and unnerves you, because that means that we're doing it right at the university. You know, university is not a place where you get your ideas confirmed, but you get them interrogated, where you come up with new ideas based on what you previously might have thought. So that's my goal for today, to make you uncomfortable by sharing something on this topic. I would really be interested in your ideas too. You know, as you heard from that bio, which we need to shorten, by the way, it's too long. I do a lot of teaching and I do a lot of writing, and I'm very used to hearing my own voice, but I would be much more interested in hearing your voice after I share some thoughts. So I hope that we have enough time for a little question and answer or something along those lines, okay? So the title for today's talk is that storytelling has been stripped of all meaning. And really, the word all should be in parentheses there, or in quotation marks, because it's not really all meaning, but let's just say most of its meaning, okay? And I'm going to explain to you why I think this word storytelling is going through a phase right now that people like me are not very happy about, okay? So students, if there are any students of mine that are in this webinar, then they know that the very first thing that we talk about whenever we have a class on storytelling or story writing or anything like that, the very first thing that we must discuss is the same thing that should be discussed no matter what class you're taking, literally no matter what subject it might be. The first course meeting should be on one thing and one thing only, which is, what is that thing? If we are studying organic chemistry, or we're studying tennis, or we're studying something else, we have to say, what is organic chemistry? What does it mean? Right? If we don't understand that, then there's really there's no further that we can go. Okay? It's quite limited in terms of how far we can go if we're not on the page about what that thing actually is. What is tennis? How does it differ from other sports? All these things, okay? So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what is a story? So this question is so important that we could talk about it not for the rest of our time together, but for a week. Nothing but this question. And the reason why this question is so difficult to answer is because I would argue that the word story is the second most misused word in all of the English language. Misconstrued, mangled, misused in every possible way that you can think of. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the word story, the term story, is really not even so much a word in English. It's more like an umbrella term. Umbrella means it kind of covers all kinds of different ideas. So like the word, for example, some short story authors are writing short stories like this. Sometimes authors like J.K. Rowling and George R.R. Martin, they're writing thick stories like this. When you read a newspaper, you read the story that has been printed. If a television anchor is delivering something, that we call that a story, right? Some people say with a tweet, you can write a 160 character story. Okay. If you go to a courtroom, the lawyer is telling the jury a story, right? And of course, now Instagram tells us that a picture of our breakfast in the morning is a story, right? It's getting to the point where story, the word story, has basically become synonymous with anything that I find interesting. If I find it interesting, we'll call it a story. Okay. So that's not what a story is. Okay, there's nothing. I always tell my students that the word police are not going to come to your door and say, hey, stop using that word story for anything that I find interesting. But you're tuning in because you want to know something about the world of storytelling. Okay, and if we go by that idea that a story is everything, like I hear students say to me, like every moment is a story. Everything around us is a story. Well, if everything is a story, how can you possibly be better at writing stories and telling stories, right? How do I write everything down? How do I tell everything? If every moment is a story, actually, it's incorrect. A story is not everything. In fact, we know this. If anybody here is studying literature, then you know that there's such things as poetry and stream of consciousness and journaling and novels and fiction and nonfiction, all these different categories of things. And a story is one of those things, like an essay, like other types of writing. A story has its own place and its own parameters, its own shape. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about what that shape is. But in our pop culture that we live in, anything that I find interesting is a story. That's going to come back to haunt anyone who wants to make storytelling into some type of career. By the way, the most misused word, I believe, in the English language is the word democracy. We talk about democracy meaning basically like any country or group of people or organization or something like that has voting. If you have voting, you have democracy. But it really takes about 3 seconds of thinking about it to realize how absurd that definition is, because if you don't have things like labor rights and gender equality and LGBTQ rights and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, if you don't have those, then voting really doesn't matter at all when it comes to democracy. I mean, after all, you probably know this, that every 5 years North Korea has voting, right? So voting is actually a very superficial part of democracy, but we use this word interchangeably. If there's elections of any kind, voting of any kind, we call it democracy. If anything I find interesting is out there, including a picture of my breakfast, we can call it a story, but it is not a story. Okay, so now you might be saying, well, who cares? What does it matter? Why can't we just call it a story or not? And I'm going to explain to you why I think it matters. Okay. In the business world, you can go on LinkedIn right now and check this. If you don't believe me, you can go and check it right now. And you'll see tons of positions. There must be thousands of positions out there that used to be marketing positions that are now called something like corporate storyteller. Okay, you probably have seen these things. Maybe you've even applied for a job like that, like company storyteller or something. And we see this everywhere. You see it on business cards, you see it on web profiles all over the place. So what's going on here? Why is that happening? Okay, well, here's why it's happening. Because science, biology, neurology, history has taught all of us in the past, like it's been clear before this, but really in the past 25 years with absolute certainty, that storytelling is the stickiest form of communication. What do I mean by sticky? Sticky means something that stays with you, okay? For example, one of the definitions that I give for a story in my class, when I have a story writing class, one of the definitions is a story is information that has been put together in a very particular shape to make it unforgettable. Right? Ordinary information, you might know this, ordinary information, very, very forgettable. You take that same information and you put it together in a very particular fashion, suddenly it becomes unforgettable. That's the fashion that we're talking about, the method, the shape of that is a story. Story is the stickiest, biologically, neurologically, the stickiest form of communication that human beings have. So people who make ads and marketers, they want their ideas to be sticky. Okay, if you are making an ad, you want people to remember it after it's flashed on the screen or something like that. So basically, this idea, we have the stickiest form of communication is storytelling. We want to make sticky stuff because we are ad makers or we are marketers. So we're just going to say, I am a corporate storyteller. And just use that word because that word has power to it. But actually, when we use the word in that way, we're using it in that pop culture way that I talked about before. Now, you might say, well, no, they're not using it like that. They're trying to say that the ads we make are like really interesting and captivating. Well, that's a different thing. Interesting and captivating are something else, right? So that's a different type. Like you can make sticky communication that is not a story. I'll give you an example, like a surprising image, a funny face, a hilarious little tagline, you know, that jingle from that commercial that you heard 1,000 times when you were little, right? That's sticky. All of that stuff is sticky in your head. You can remember it all these years later, but it's not a story. Okay, so sticky communication, there is an art to how to do sticky communication, and it's been around and we know how to do it. There is no need to deface the word story by sticking it on there and saying, just because I've created a memorable image, I've made a story. Now you might be saying, so what? Who cares? Why can't you just let people use the word storyteller? And of course I can. I have no monopoly over the truth or anything like that. But the problem is that for young people, if there's any young people that are kind of tuning in and watching this, when the word story gets diluted so much so that it's basically any cluster of images on your television screen or in between YouTube ads or something like that is a story, you are actually robbing yourself of an opportunity to find out what a true story actually is and what potential it has. So I don't want to get too much into politics, but basically here's how these two worlds kind of intersect, okay? So we live in a capitalist culture, okay? And one of the ideas in a capitalist culture is that the more things you buy, the happier you will be. Okay, that's kind of how the culture works. Our happiness is derived from things. Now, we know that this is not true. However, this is like the air that we breathe. Some people try to say, like, I'm aware of that. It's kind of like saying that the fish is aware of the water. You know, it surrounds you, okay? And because capitalist culture is all pervasive in that way, every core principle, idea, activity is in some way measured by its impact on that capitalist culture. So, for example, storytelling in the truncated, immature way that I've been describing it, this pop culture reference that everything sticky is a story, it is in service of buying and selling, making money as an ad or something like that. But storytelling, stories actually have so much incredible potential beyond just their ability to buy and sell something. That's such a small part of it. Does storytelling make an impact on a person that may eventually result in them buying something or not buying something? Yes. But it's so sad that storytelling has been reduced down to just that. Stories, and sometimes those students will ask me, like, what do you think the point of a story is? And honestly, stories teach us how to live. Stories help us find the inspiration to overcome our fears, to be vulnerable enough to have courage in life. Stories teach us how to have relationships that are meaningful and not superficial. So stories teach us the importance of understanding where we've come from, where we are now, and where we're going. All of these are intricately involved. Overcoming our traumas, becoming a better person every day, right? Storytelling is about transformation of the reader, of the character, right? Psychological transformation, physical transformation, transformation of the world around us. So for me, for somebody who has such a elevated idea of what a true story can mean for the quality of our lives, to see it reduced down to corporate storyteller, maybe I can use some of these storytelling ideas to try to sell you a washing machine. You can understand how that makes me sad, because I feel like that is being taught to people. Stories are helpful in as much as that they can help us to buy and sell something rather than their full potential. So no, like a grandmother and a grandson bonding over a washing machine is in a commercial is not a story. Okay. Neither is being in a coffee shop, a commercial about a girl in a coffee shop who finds the courage to ask her crush out on a date, who's sitting in the coffee shop. No, this is not a story. Okay. It's just an interesting sequence of images. But in the world that we live in, we call that a story, no matter what it is. And if I was a marketer, and even though I'm not interested in that world, if I was a marketer and a corporate ad maker, I would call myself a storyteller too, because that word has a ton of power, and we know that it does. But I would be delusional if I thought I was actually building stories. Instead, I'm building moments that I hope are sticky enough to justify the huge amount that the client is paying me. So if all of that is true, and I'm saying, okay, these are not stories, these other things are stories, then what do I mean by that? What actually is a story? So the story is many different things. A story has a complex architecture behind it, but if I really had to distill it down to two simple things, if I had to take the whole world, the whole field of storytelling and narrow it down to two terms, I would say that one, story has something to do with a problem. Okay? All stories are about solving a problem. Now, that problem can be out in the world, can be a big thing like a global warming, it can be something like a company going under, it can be a court case that needs to be resolved. It can also be something inside. Maybe the character is fighting some inner demons or bad habits and they want to change and they need to change, right? A problem. There must be a problem in order for us to at least have the beginning of a story. And the final ingredient, the final essential ingredient to this is a story is a journey of change. If there is no change, there is no story. So I'll just repeat that again. If there is no change, there is no story. The three big types of changes that we look for in storytelling are change in circumstance, something out in the world is changing, change in insight, something inside the character is changing, and change in relationship. Some relationship between the two characters is transforming. So problem and problem solving and change and transformation. So if you think about stories that way, you recognize the socio-psychic ability that stories have to transform our lives. When we really appreciate the potential of storytelling, we understand that stories are a method by which we can address the bad things that we don't want to have inside us and fill them with inspirational new ideas by looking at the mistakes people have made in the past, by looking at the triumphs that people have had in the past, both fiction and nonfiction. When we think about these things only in so much as that they can serve the bottom line of a business, we're missing that opportunity. And to me, I've been lucky enough that I've had an education that has emphasized the non-market use of storytelling. But in a capitalist world, that the voice that says, how does this, how useful is this vis-a-vis our buying and selling, is usually a louder voice. And to me, that's very sad as a writer and as someone who not just wants stories, but needs them and believes that the culture needs them in order to live. So For students that are interested in some of the deeper parameters, because it's very easy for me to sit here and say, well, stories are about problem solving and about transformation. For those of you who are interested in how do those things take place in a story, in other words, those are the principles, great, but like what are the blueprint to make those principles actually into fruition on the page or on the screen or on the small screen? We have to get into things like story structure and the universal story structure and how exposition fits with the break in routine and the revelation and all of these other pieces taught to us by all kinds of theorists, including Joseph Campbell and others, have taught us how stories are actually built. And those stories go back to a long way to religious traditions and mythical traditions and so forth. But the reason for the kind of harsh title for the talk that I wanted to give you today was because storytelling it is almost used in such a narrow way in terms of its usefulness to the corporate world that we're ignoring all of that social and personal development that's possible in a great story. So really, that's all I really had to share. I'm happy to keep talking as well. If you have more questions about any aspects of storytelling or any aspects of corporate storytelling or anything like that, I'll be more than, I have a lot more to share, but I also wanted to keep it brief in case anybody has something that they would like to share and that I can respond to. Feel free to ask a question if you'd like.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much. That was very insightful. We do have some questions.
Okay.
One of the question here says the difference between storytelling and modern blogs, if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And another question is, are all stories imaginative?
Okay, good. We'll take those one at a time. So sometimes, because I run this outside of Flame, I run this storytelling organization. Sometimes about once a week or so, people will send me pieces that they've written and they'll ask for my advice. And they'll say, I've written this story. Can you give me some thoughts on it? You know, and then I'll read it and I'll open it up and it'll be something like my 5 favorite places in Bombay. Okay. And it'll go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first one might be something like the National Park. The next one will be the Gateway of India, and then the Dhobi Ghat, you know, and then maybe a bandstand or something like this, right? And I'll go through it. I'll look at, maybe make some comments, enjoy it, and I'll write back to them and I'll say something like, "Thank you so much for this piece. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about the city. It's not a story, but I really think that you have a lot of potential as a writer." And of course, the first thing that somebody will write back is, "What do you mean it's not a story?" And I'll say, describing 5 places is just describing 5 places. If you want to be technical, that's something called exposition in story writing, which is zooming in on the where. Okay, and the where is an important part of the foundation of a house, but it's not the house. We also need the story part. You know, so one of the problems is that most people are so familiar with this pop culture. By the way, it's such a nice sounding idea. Like every moment is a story. Yeah, very nice sounding. I understand, but it's not so helpful when it comes time for you to actually write a story, right? So my 5 favorite places in Bombay, wonderful, awesome, potential to be a story, not a story yet. Same thing with blogging. So blogging is basically a slightly more formal version of journaling. So journaling is like my ideas, my reflection on what's happening in the world around me and my life, you know, kind of going back and forth between those things. Here's my take on something. Wonderful. So incredibly useful. If anybody who's ever read like historical letters or anything like that, unbelievably insightful, right? You can gain so much information by reading somebody's old letters or blogs or something like that, especially people you admire. Like, you know, I feel like a few family members of mine have died before I was able to preserve some of their letters and journals. I would love to read that. So is this stuff unbelievably valuable? Yes. Is it a story? No, right? It's just your inner reflections written down on a blog. But the funny thing is, it's like, it doesn't have to be a story to be meaningful. Sometimes people will come to my class or my workshops outside of Flame, and they'll say, "Why are you saying that if it's a story, it's interesting? If it's not a story, it's boring?" I was like, "Oh my God, you haven't listened to a word I've said. All I've said to you is that you can write great things that are also not stories. Why must everything be labeled story, 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 story? In fact, like it's a huge disservice to the world of poetry, for example, to simply say all of these are stories. Why? Why do they have to be stories? They don't. And the same thing with blogs. Blogs do not have to be stories, and they're not stories. Can we use some of the same principles from story writing and blogs? Yes, but let's not kid ourselves that this is actual story. It's just something I always kind of like to make this joke when I could do a workshop with, especially with an older audience of adults. I'll say that there's only one situation in life where whatever is on the piece of paper in front of you is a story, no matter what, and you cannot argue with it. And the answer is, like, maybe some of the young people who are watching, maybe someday you'll be a parent, okay? And your child will hand you a piece of paper and say, Mommy, I wrote this story in school today, right? You're not going to take out the magnifying glass and say, actually, it's missing these story structure elements, right? You're going to say, it's an awesome story. It's the best story I've ever read. But that's the one exception. Outside of that, right, we have to start talking about what a story is and what a story isn't in order to be better writers. The other one is, like, all stories imaginative. Basically, the answer is basically no, but it's not completely no, because storytelling can come in the form of fiction and nonfiction. So stories, even though when we think about the word story, we tend to think about something like a fairy tale, storytelling transcends the world of make-believe and real life. So storytelling happens in all kinds of forms. My organization, Tall Tales, this longest running story series in India, we've had 86 shows and over 4,000 stories submitted where people are telling true stories to other adults. So it's a storytelling organization that specializes only in real life captivating stories. So do those have to use some imagination in order to put them together? Sure. Are any of the facts from a make-believe? No. All of it is 100% true. So imagination is a useful tool to have, but stories can be both fiction and nonfiction.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Also, we spoke about how change is an essential component in a story.
Yeah.
So, does this change always have to be shown, or can it also be implied in some cases?
Good. Now you're starting to get into kind of a more sophisticated question, which is like, how explicit do we have to be in storytelling? And, the answer to this really has to do with the kind of maturity of the audience. Like, how do almost every children's book end, which is with this thing, and they lived happily ever after? Like the author feels like they have to point out to the audience that like everything worked out so perfectly, and this is kind of like, you could kind of say, like talking down to the reader, by kind of connecting these dots for them. But the older we get, generally speaking, we kind of get more mature as we get older. Not true for everyone, but for most people, that's how it works. The older we get, the less we like the author to make those connections for us. We like the challenge of being able to figure it out. So if I am creating a character of an old woman cleaning the house, I can tell by the way that she's cleaning that life has pulled her down, right? And then she's going to have a visit from her nephew. And they're just going to talk for a little while. And then I'm going to watch her clean after that. And I can tell by the way that she's cleaning that she's been lifted up by this conversation. I don't need to be told it. If this was a book for an 8-year-old, the author would say something like, and thinking about her nephew, suddenly she had a pep in her step and she had more energy as she, right? I don't need to be told all of those things. So it's really a question of keeping, as you write for adults and as Flame students are kind of moving more into that mature storytelling, we like to do this thing called show, don't tell. It's like one of the cardinal rules of strong writing: show, don't tell. Show me what's happening and let me come to the conclusion of what has changed. I don't need to be told that she is no longer a drug addict. I can tell by the fact that she left the party where all those drugs were going on and she's decided this is not the life for me. You know what I mean? I can connect some of those dots myself.
Absolutely. One another question is, what makes one a good storyteller?
Well, this is a really interesting question because I've told a lot of stories at Tall Tales, maybe 40 different stories at Tales over the years. And some people will say to me, how can you possibly have so many life experiences to share, you know? And I will say, well, sometimes when something weird is happening around you, like there is a natural tendency to back away from it. You know, like if there is an argument, for example, where I am right now, I'm at a major intersection in Mumbai. If there is an argument in the street, right, people will kind of take a curious look, but if it gets too crazy, they'll kind of back away, you know. But whenever I see something strange happening, I run towards it as fast as I can because I want to see this window into human nature. So the weirder something is, the more curious I become about its inner workings. And why am I mentioning that to you? Because if you want to be a better storyteller, by far, the most important quality that you need to nurture in yourself is curiosity. If you're not interested in the world out there and how other people operate, how they think and why they do what they do, you will never be a good storyteller, because storytelling is all about looking deeper, showing you something that you've seen 1,000 times, but you've never quite looked at it this way. So the word for that is curiosity, being able to revisit ideas, concepts, experiences that you've had 1,000,000 times, but you just never really stopped to think about what you were doing or what you were looking at. So I really love that. And, you know, there are many things about my country that I don't like. I come from the US and I can sit here all day and point out all the things that I don't like about it. But there is one thing I absolutely love about it, which is that there's the spirit of experimenting. Like just because something has been done the same way for 1,000,000 years doesn't mean we have to do it that way. Just because we think about this idea like this doesn't mean that's the only way to think about it. And that's a really good trait because it encourages curiosity, and therefore, de facto, it ends up encouraging storytelling.
Great. Other question is, how do imaginative stories and narratives from personal experiences affect the listeners or impact the listeners differently?
I don't think they impact the listeners differently at all, because as you know, think about our dreams, for example. The dreams are so incredibly weird and abstract. It's like these are real experiences that we're really having that are so incredibly bizarre, right? And in other words, there's this thing like nothing. I've always said this, and I really do believe it. Nothing is weirder than real life. Like real life is so incredibly insane, you know. So I don't think we have to kind of compare the experiences of real life and the imagination. They both have the ability to take you on an incredible ride to show you what life is like in somebody else's shoes. Now, it's also a matter of taste. Like, for example, if we just had a debate between the two of us and you said vanilla is best and I say chocolate is best, we will never resolve it, right? Because it's just a matter of aesthetic taste. It has nothing to do with the correct or incorrect answer. I happen to love nonfiction stories slightly more. For some reason, I like that flavor a little bit more. My favorite book of all time, however, is a fiction book, To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee's masterpiece. So I also love fiction. So it's just really more of a matter of taste. It's not a question of right or wrong or what's better, what's more nurturing to the soul, all of these things, you know. I will say this, though. There is one little kind of little catchphrase that I like to use is like, I always like to say that nonfiction teaches me how to think. So if like I read a book about logic, or I read a book about the universe, or I read a book about psychology, like nonfiction teaches me how to think, whereas fiction teaches me how to live. I really do think that. So they both are important, right? You need both of those.
So, Professor, definitely when you say that the term story has been used in a very small context these days and it has been generalized that way, one question that we have here is, aren't all stories about marketing? We try selling an idea to convince people to get influenced or engaged. So, why is its diluted version, for example, in an ad, that different from it?
Certainly not all stories are about marketing. I mean, think about marketing. You know, you're making the assumption that capitalist culture is the only culture possible. You know, That's only, it's one. I mean, even on this planet alone, even in this country alone, we have other states that have different ways of thinking about organizing their economies and organizing their social interactions and their social currency, right? So not, certainly not all stories are about marketing. In other words, you're asking like, what's the point of this story? The point of most stories in history was to serve as rituals and rites for the society. So a lot of storytelling involved things like marriage ceremonies, death ceremonies, moving through puberty and things like that, becoming an adult, inheriting responsibilities in the village, all kinds of things. Storytelling was often oriented around those rites of passage. Okay, what is the market value of the rites of that rite of passage? None, zero. It's about inheriting the responsibility and taking care of your loved ones as they get older. What does that have to do with buying and selling? Right? I think sometimes, and everyone's guilty of this, not just young people, we kind of think of the 21st century as like, this is how it's always been. Actually, the history of our species is quite different, going back to hunters and gatherers and all these types of things, right? The way people organize their societies and the stories that they use to mark those landmarks in that society, totally non-market. I mean, these are the things that make life worth living. So again, there's nothing wrong with corporate storytelling, but I just wish that they would stop calling it storytelling, because it should be called corporate stickiness or something like that. Lots of things are sticky. I'm sure that all of you, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm sure most of you have some jingle from some commercial stuck in your head from when you were 10 years old and you heard it on TV over and over and over again. That's not a story. It's just a sticky jingle. You know, so can we just be honest? You know, so honestly, I have some friends who give me their business cards and says corporate storyteller, and of course I'm not going to say what I really think. I always say good luck, good for you. How you doing? Hope work is going great for you. But in this capacity, in an academic capacity, you're asking me to analyze it, and in that sense, we're not doing storytelling. We're just doing fancy ads, and nobody wants to say they're an ad maker. Nobody wants to say that, so they say that I'm a storyteller.
Makes sense. To just make your point clear and the distinction better, can you just share a sample story which, according to you, is very inspiring or transcending, a story that you've come across?
Uh, so many stories. Well, trying to think of something I could tell briefly here. Sure, I'll tell you one. It's going to be about 6 minutes long. Okay. So I'll tell you because the person who's involved in the story was recently visiting Bombay a few months ago. When I was 20 years old, I did an internship in Indonesia. This was my first time to this part of the world. I flew from New York to Jakarta, and I had a research partner, okay, like a fellow student. I was a master's student at the time, and he was also a student, and we flew together. His name was Deepinder Mayel. I mean, it's funny. The U.S. is a crazy place. Like, we always joke that I'm more Indian than Deepinder, and he's more American than I am. You know, this is for the country that I come from. So before I go any further, I need to tell you that Deep and I are very close friends, okay? Very close friends today. And the reason I feel like I need to mention that is because when we were together at this internship, I did something to him one night that was very, very cruel, but also incredibly funny, okay? So I just want you to know that no matter what you hear in the next few minutes, Deep and I are very close friends today, okay? So we lived in a house in Jakarta. We rented a house in a neighborhood called Rawamangun. This is like on the outskirts of Jakarta. And the way that the house was designed was that, and they might have this in some Indian houses too, is that the roof wasn't like fully attached to the walls. There was some space there for ventilation. If you don't do that in very hot places, it can become like a sauna in the house. So even though we had AC in some of the upper rooms, in the living room, we had this kind of like incomplete wall to allow some air in. Well, it was really nice, but the problem was anytime we left any food out of any kind, even if we didn't leave food out, there would instantly be bugs all over the place, from ants, but the worst ones were cockroaches, like big ones, big ones. And Deep and I used to always say that the way that you would know that a cockroach was in the room with you is you could hear it walking on the floor. I mean, that's how big they are, So So every day we would kind of fight with these cockroaches, and we would come home from work and we would see two or three of them, and we would kind of like sweep them into the bin and all that stuff. We would be grossed out. We were really afraid of them. So one day we decided to go on a road trip, and we had two friends who worked at the internet cafe. This was back when they had internet cafes down the end of the road. We decided to go on a 2-week road trip with them to a place called Yogyakarta. We want to see some volcanoes and stuff like that. And we had an amazing time. And I'll never forget, as we were driving back onto our road was called Jalan Belanak Dua. Okay, we pulled onto Jalan Belanak Dua in Rawamangun. And as soon as we pulled into the driveway, I turned to Deep and I said, "Oh man, can you imagine what the cockroach situation is inside?" And he was like, "Oh my God, I didn't even think about that." I was like, "We're gone for 5 hours and there's 6 of them. What is it going to be like when we're gone for 2 weeks, you know?" So we kind of took a deep breath. We reached inside the door before fully opening it and pulled out a can of like bug spray. And then we opened the door and kind of flicked on the light as quickly as we could. And we're looking around everywhere and we couldn't find any. And we were like, we know that they're hiding here somewhere. So we went in the other rooms. We couldn't find anything. We were just like, oh my God, I guess we got so lucky. Sometimes that can happen, you know? So I sat down and we were having some drinks and some pizza. And after about 20 minutes of drinking stuff, sometimes you have to go use the bathroom. And I walked over to our bathroom and I went in and I flicked on the light. And I love horror movies. And this was something straight out of a horror movie. There were cockroaches on the toilet, on the sink, on the mirror, on the back of the door, on the roof of the bathroom. Everywhere you look, there was probably 100 cockroaches just sitting there. And of course, I'm terrified of them. But so I realized what was happening, and I just shut the door quietly, waited for as long as I could possibly bear it, flushed the toilet, and then left calmly and just sat back down with Deep, you know. So then I'm just like, "Hey, Deep, would you like another drink?" You know, pour him some extra drinks and stuff like that. And then after about 20 minutes, he got up and sauntered over to the bathroom, and I pretended like there was something over in the bathroom that I needed to do, like near the door of the bathroom. And when he went into the bathroom and flicked on the light, I took the door, pulled it shut, and held it with all of my possible strength. And I've never heard a man scream at that volume that he had. You know, it's one of those like screams that's kind of like laughing and screaming at the same time type of thing. And I held on to it. And I could feel him like pulling as hard as he could, you know. And then finally, after maybe a good 60 seconds of torment, I opened the door, and then we would just like collapse with laughter. So yeah, it's important for me to always start that by saying, because that's the type of thing that could traumatize and end a relationship. But we both enjoyed it. And now we're still friends even today. And Deep came to visit a few months ago. I saw him here in Bombay. So that's an example of a story for you.
Great. So, Professor, anything else you would want to share before we conclude?
Basically, it's just this, is that if you want to be good at something in life, you have to work on it and you have to practice. Nothing great has ever come with very little effort, you know? And I think it's really strange when it comes to certain academic things. Like, for example, if we have this lovely golf course, Oxford Golf Course next to Flame. And if I handed you a golf club and you've never played before, and I say, I want you to go show me what you can do, you would look at me and say, but I've never played before. I'm going to be very bad. I don't really play golf. I'd like to be good at it maybe someday, but I'm going to be very bad for a long time. We would both recognize that as completely logical. But if I said to you, hey, write me a little story, and you wrote something and it was not that great, and I said to you, okay, this is okay, but I think you can do better. A lot of young people kind of say, well, I guess I'm not a story person, or I guess I'm not cut out for storytelling. So it's very weird because it's like, no, it takes time. You know, it takes time to be better at everything. And if we don't think that way, we rob ourselves of a lot of opportunities to grow. Every single person who ever started any activity was terrible at it. And the problem is we didn't see all of those 10,000 hours of them being bad at it. We only saw the end point. So we say, oh, Stephen King must be born with the ability to do that. Serena Williams must be born with the ability to do that. No, they practiced it and they failed over and over and over again. So if you want to be a writer, you want to be a storyteller, you have to realize that your first, second, third, 1,000th attempt will be poor, but you learn from those mistakes and you get better, just like with everything else in life.
That's absolutely true. I think a lot of people here also want to reach out to you other than this session. So, could you just share your email ID in the chat box?
Yes, sure. So, this is my university ID. And you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this is my storytelling organization. I'm teaching a writing workshop 2 Sundays from tomorrow. So I think the 12th of March, I'll be teaching a storytelling workshop in Bombay. So if somebody wants to learn a little bit more details, they're welcome to come to that. I usually do about 2 sessions a month at Flame also on some details of story writing, story analysis, story structure. So something along those lines too.
Okay, I think overall it was a very insightful session. Thank you so
Great.
much for your time.
Thank
I hope
you.
everybody had a great time as well. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.